Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second program day of our conference. We have a really exciting opportunity this morning, I think, to get into what I hope is going to be a really fun and lively conversation about new models and maybe not so new models and different ways to approach philanthropy. And we'll touch on a lot of topics. We're going to talk about whether companies are indeed playing a bigger role in pursuing important social goals and what that means for institutional foundations, for new donors, for others, for society. We'll talk about the different way foundations can achieve their goals beyond grant making. We'll talk about openness and data and how we make sense of big data, and hopefully we're going to touch on a lot, and we have a great group of folks to do it. I think they're not going to agree on everything. I sure hope not. So that's part of the fun. So let me tell you who's here, and also let you know that I'm going to engage you throughout this conversation. So on your far left is Jacquelline Fuller, who leads Google.org. Next to her is Stephen Heintz, president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Larry Kramer of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Clara Larson of the David and Lucile Packard Foundation. Clara Miller of the FB Heron Foundation. Cari Tuna of Good Ventures. Jane Wales of Global Philanthropy Forum and the World Affairs Council. And Sylvia Yee, Vice President of Programs at the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. So let's welcome our terrific panel. So let's dive right in. Let's start with you, Jacqueline. There's been a lot of talk about the role that companies can play in doing good while also generating a profit, and increasingly, we hear that there isn't even a trade-off. You know, you can have your cake and eat it too, or in the words of the old SNL skit, it's a floor cleaner and a dessert topping. How do you think about Google's responsibility and role in pursuing goals beyond growth and profit for the business?
Sure. So good morning, everybody. I'm actually amazed to see how many bright, shiny faces we have at such an early panel. This is wonderful. So I'll say a quick word about Google.org. So we're Google's philanthropy. Google, across the entire company, we give about $150 million each year. We provide about $1 billion worth of free products, free ads and apps for nonprofits, essentially. And we donate about 50,000 hours of Googler time. So this is our employees and what they do. And in terms of what we fund and how we invest, we really look for innovation, probably not surprising, since we're Google. So we look for ways that we can fund catalytic entrepreneurs who are doing things like testing drones to fight poaching in Africa, or developing water flow sensors to measure whether those wells that we're all funding are actually working. We look for a grants plus Google model, so we want to invest not just grant funds, but we want to look for ways where we can be uniquely impactful and where we can give not only money to our partners, but come alongside them with the rest of Google. So that might be providing engineers, it might be marketing, it might be using Google's reach or brand. And then the third thing we look for is what we call googly, which actually is a word that we use around Google. When I first joined about 8 years ago, I thought that, seriously people, you actually use that term? But we do indeed use that term in a straight face. So googly for us means, is it data-driven, based on evidence? Is it open, transparent? Is the team nimble, agile? Are they willing to fail and fail fast? And so that's what we look for, and that's typically what we fund. I mean, speaking about the sector, more broadly, I would say we're seeing a little bit more movement, but we could see a lot more. And and not just having our cake and eating it too, but giving some of that cake away. And so if you look at the broader picture of giving, corporations represent only about 5% of that total giving. So we have a long way to go. And in fact, even if you took a fairly modest milestone, like giving 1% of net profit, Google's committed to giving north of that. But even if all companies gave 1%, we would have at least 100 billion more to work with. And if they gave it in smart ways that are aligned with who they are and what they do best, we could have even more impact.
And when you think about the role that technology is playing, a lot of folks describe the huge potential for positive change driven by technology, but then others describe all kinds of frightening futures in which, or maybe even present day reality in which everything is known about everyone, and in which technology has sort of driven inequality, and certainly that's been a critique here in the Bay Area. How much of a live debate is that for you with your colleagues, and how do you think about your role and responsibility, maybe to narrow it in a little bit, in particular on this issue of inequality in the Bay Area and beyond?
Yeah, so first on the issue of technology, I'll be the first to say technology is not the solution to everything. And I worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for 8 years before coming to Google. And I remember Bill on a panel, would always get asked, is technology going to really, make the biggest impact in the developing world? And he would look at them and say, no. Vaccines will make the biggest difference in the developing world. So I think we have to be careful to understand that technology is certainly not the solution. But I also think, look, every corporation, every individual, every foundation has to figure out how can we be most impactful? What are we singularly good at? What do we know? And what is the best of ourselves that we can bring to the table to make the biggest impact? So for Google, that's technology. And we actually asked our grantees, we did a look back a few years ago at our first sort of 8 years of giving. And it was interesting because the number one thing we heard back from people was fund technology, because nobody else will. And so Google, one thing that we understand as a tech company is we understand taking informed risk. And we understand that not all technology is going to work. And in fact, when I went to my CFO with my portfolio recently, he said, this looks good, but I want you to increase your failure rate. You're not failing enough. So you're not investing, that means you're not leaning in and investing in enough in true innovation. So for us at least, technology makes sense. When it comes to inequality, we've had a very important conversation here locally, and Google's headquarters is here in the Bay Area. We have a very large presence down in Mountain View. We have an office here in the city that me and my team work at. And I think we've had a really important conversation about, hey, there's been a tech boom in this region, but not everybody is benefiting from that. And in fact, a lot of people are bearing the negative externalities that come from that kind of rapid growth. And so are asking very important questions, I think, which are, what are, hey Google, hey tech industry, hey other corporations who are part of the boom that is happening here, what are you doing to give back locally to the community? So Google itself, we've always given locally. We've been in the top 5 corporate funders, for the past 5 years. But we looked at what we were giving to and how we were doing it, to see, how can we address more specifically, not with the needs of the community, not with things like self-driving cars, which are going to save tens of thousands, if not millions of lives every year, but are a long time away. But what are we doing specifically to address the needs here? So we did things like launch an impact challenge, where we just opened it up to every single nonprofit in the Bay Area and said, tell us your best ideas for how you would use $500,000 plus innovation to make the Bay Area even better, to just kind of raise up and hear from voices that we don't necessarily hear from on the cocktail party circuit.
Great. Now, Stephen, I've heard you talk about part of the role of, we've heard, I guess, since probably the 90s that the boundaries are blurring, and and this gets described as a wonderful thing. Everybody's coming together, and there's some folks, I would be one of them, and I think you're another, say, well, actually, sometimes boundaries are helpful, and sometimes the role of nonprofits and foundations is to try to influence corporate behavior. Is that what divesting from fossil fuels was about for you? And why aren't, we heard the data yesterday, why aren't more folks yet, I know it's early, but following your lead on that?
Well, thanks, Bill. First of all, I just want to take this moment to congratulate you and your team on what is really a great conference. It's really terrific. So
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much. At least until this moment. So, I want to put the divestment decision into a little bit of a broader context. We heard yesterday from Barbara Kellerman about her ideas about leadership, and she talks about leadership as a system, not as a person. And, I think there's a lot in that, and I think foundations need to be leadership systems. They need to be leadership institutions. And when we think systematically about foundations, it's a lot more than just the grants. It's about our intellectual capital, it's about our endowment capital, it's about our reputational capital, it's about our relational capital. And if we think about that system and try to exert leadership through the system, internally and externally, I think you can at least begin to increase the level of impact you have. So for us, the divestment decision, which was not easy, took a long time to actually get all of the stakeholders aligned, especially, as you might imagine, dealing with the Rockefeller family, whose wealth, of course, came from fossil fuels. And we knew that the irony of that was actually what made it an important story and would get the kind of international attention that it did, and that was part of its value, frankly, was just lifting up this issue in a different way than some of the other discourse about climate change. But it was in the context of trying to look at all of our different systems and assets and trying to provide leadership, and voice is another way that one provides leadership. Now, we were asked, of course, when we made the announcement, isn't this just symbolic? You're relatively small, the market is huge. And my answer was, yes, this is symbolic, but symbols are really important. People identify with symbols, people follow symbols, people are inspired by symbols. But it also, if it works, will begin to send real market signals. And while not every foundation is rushing to divest, because it is very complicated, and Larry will tell you why he doesn't think it's a good idea, or why the Hewlett Foundation is in fact considering divestment. But a lot of others are, and I've been having conversations with foundations actually all over the world since we made our decision, who want to know how we went through the process, what was the decision making like, what were the factors you considered, what do you think the impact is going to be on your endowment, on the returns, what do you think the impact is going to be on the market? And I think between now and the Paris Conference of the Parties, the international climate negotiations that will take place at the end of this year, we will probably go from the 60 to 70 foundations who signed up for the divestment by the end of last year to close to 200. So, this is progress. Is it changing the world? No, but is it another way of using our leadership capacity on an issue of huge concern, maybe the most profound issue of this century? I think it's an important additional step.
Great. Now, so you've divested from fossil fuels. Clara, on your website, it says you invest all your assets in mission, all your assets, and that you're tax status agnostic. Can you give me the elevator talk, to mom or dad? What are you doing? What does this mean?
Well, I mean, it's not that hard to understand. It's kind of like we
I'm a little slow.
It's early.
We maintain that that really all investing is impact investing. I'm asked a lot about, well, are other foundations doing impact investing too? And I almost always say 100, foundations are investing 100% of their assets for impact. They just don't know if the impact is positive or negative. And we feel that it's our fiduciary responsibility as a philanthropic institution. We have a duty of care and loyalty, which all companies have. But as a philanthropic institution, we also have a duty of obedience to mission, and that applies to all of our assets. We believe that the current systemic problems that Stephen was citing have made things so urgent that to leave any resource untapped is irresponsible. We think in today's world that that environmental and social problems compound if they're not addressed, that prevention has an urgent premium in a way that cure doesn't today. Very much on Stephen's point, and that externalities are becoming material risk to investors. That in fact, the idea that somehow we can be in a bubble, we can be in a terrarium doing our work with small grants and ignoring 100% of our assets when we do it is no longer viable as a philanthropic model.
Does anyone want to?
Could I just
Yeah.
add something to what
Yeah.
Clara is a very good point? Because as we looked at the fossil fuel situation, we felt that we were being a bit hypocritical with half of our grant making fighting climate change and 9 or 10% of our endowment invested in the fossil fuels that are causing global warming. And we also began to do the economic analysis, and this is to Clara's point, which shows that if in fact the world is going to meet the demand of science, which is to keep global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius over the industrial level, and we're already at 1.8, so we don't have much room for error here, then we're going to have to really radically change in this century in terms of our energy mix. And the estimates suggest that 60 to 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves will have to stay in the ground. They can't be burned if we're going to meet that target. So the economic value of those assets, which are currently carried on the books of the major fossil fuel companies, is going to decline. So as a smart investor looking long term, you say, there may be a really important economic case to be made for acting now to begin to get out of investments that are going to lose economic value over time.
Jane, you see a lot of major donors in maybe sometimes the earlier days of their figuring out how they want to pursue impact. And you have kind of a nice, I think, perspective across a lot of different kinds of philanthropic activity. Do you think Stephen and Clara are kind of outliers, or do you think that there's more and more reflection on that? Look, what's really happening in terms of your insight on
So I
that?
guess I'd argue that today's outliers are tomorrow's leaders, right? So I see them both as leaders, and I think what's interesting about Clara is that we're all watching what she's doing. I mean, she's made a huge commitment, and there's risk. There's enormous risk. And the rest of the philanthropic community is watching, kind of, a little anxious. We're on the edge, they are on the edges of their seats. We all want her to succeed, and we're all glad she's the one taking the risk and not us. So, but I would argue that this is real leadership, and it's going to be, you have a lot to teach us. I would also say that I think that the kinds of problems that folks in this room are trying to solve are just so large that they take all three sectors. So to Clara's point about you just can't afford to leave any lever sort of unused or any resource untapped. So if you take really large problems, I take sort of slavery, since it's such a horrifying one. There's a situation in which, it turns out that slavery can be in the supply chains of my favorite grocer. It's also my favorite electronics manufacturer, and my nephew's shop at certain stores for their clothing. But corporations don't actually, they have such complex supply chains nowadays, global supply chains, that they don't always know what's in it. And so what they've been doing is turning to the nonprofit sector, turning to organizations like Verite and Oxfam and others, and say, look, conduct a supply chain audit. Tell me if there's a problem and where that problem is. And then those companies can turn around and shut down the supplier with slaves. And I'd only argue here that, and of course, those organizations were given the bandwidth, those NGOs, given both the bandwidth and the standing to do what they do by you. So here's a situation in which government sets standards, But corporations are going to need to act because that's where the problem lies. NGOs have got the freedom to move, and philanthropy provides the support for NGOs. Or else take us to Jacqueline's example of vaccines. There's no market, and there's no market for the vaccines for the diseases of the poor.
Right.
They can't pay for
Right.
that product. And so the Gates Foundation was sort of agnostic about the sector, right? They turned to pharmaceuticals because that's where the capacity, the R&D capacity lies. But Gates is providing both the upfront capital and also the guaranteed, advanced market commitments to show that, to assure the companies that they can sell those vaccines at a scale that justifies production. So I think we do our best when all three sectors are engaged. Sometimes it's in opposition, sometimes it's in tandem, but recognizing each other's roles and capacities.
Great. So we're talking now really about the different ways in which foundations, major donors can have influence. One of the things that gets described as new, but I think isn't actually factually new, is influencing policy, right? I mean, there's actually a long history of institutional foundations and individual donors seeking to influence policy and push back from those who think that's concerning, support from those who think it's an important thing to do. I want to move us there and talk about marriage equality. So we closed our opening plenary with that example because I think it's a particularly stunning example. And Sylvia, I think you've started to reflect on recognizing that every context is different, that what can we learn from the experience of you, Gill Foundation, and I know you would say the many, many, many other actors, nonprofits, foundations, others. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of what you take away from that success? Because it's been a stunning success in terms of quick movement against your goal.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Be happy to. 15 years ago, when the Haas Junior Fund became the first foundation to make marriage equality a funding priority, I didn't dare dream that we would be where we are today, which is on the cusp of a historic Supreme Court decision that we hope will bring marriage equality coast to coast. So your question is really, really timely. We've been thinking a lot about this lately. And as I look back, there's several things that strike me. It's hard to remember that not so long ago, many leaders in the gay and lesbian movement were kind of lukewarm at best to the idea of marriage. But Evan Wolfson, 15 years ago, who was then the part of the Lambda legal defense, made a compelling argument to the Haas Junior Fund that marriage was the legal gateway to more than 1,000 rights and benefits that straight people enjoyed. We started our work simply and small because really there wasn't much happening on the ground back then other than some unsuccessful law cases. And we didn't begin our work with a clear theory of change. Instead, it evolved over time. We made a bet, we funded Evan, we helped him raise the money needed for the organization that he started, which eventually developed into the National Campaign Center for the Marriage Movement. So in retrospect, one of the things that was important about the early years is that we gave ourselves and our grantees the time to muck around, to learn and to make mistakes. Second, even though my first point is about not leaping too soon to strategy, there's no way that the marriage movement would be where it is today if both funders and movement activists didn't fully get behind a common game plan. Progress definitely wasn't linear, and we also learned the importance of failing forward. In 2004, 11 states passed constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage. So we were not only not making progress, there were devastating setbacks during that time. And I remember how nervous I was walking into our board meeting that November after these elections to talk about these losses with our trustees. But rather than saying, let's pull out, our trustees said, now's not the time for us to be faint-hearted. Stay the course. We get that this is a long-haul issue. So the crisis became a major turning point in the movement. It galvanized people in the movement to double down, to learn from our losses, and to work together in a way that we had never done before. And this is what I mean by failing forward. So with foundation support, 22 leaders in the movement crafted a plan, and it laid out a strategic framework to bring the country to a tipping point in the number of states with marriage so that the Supreme Court could do the right thing. And it was this plan behind which advocates, organizers, lawyers, policy folk, and equally important funders could coordinate and align behind. It took incredible commitment and incredible discipline, and it took leaving big egos behind.
Okay.
Third, I'd like to highlight the pivotal role of strategic communications. Even with the political strategy, we also came to see that the way that we were talking about marriage wasn't working. We weren't winning hearts and minds. So in 2005, with other funders, we supported the first psychographic research to figure out why our messages about marriage being about equal rights, why that just wasn't cutting it. Through that research, we learned something that we should have known really right from the start, that when people think about marriage, they don't think about hospital visitation rights or even tax benefits. They think about being able to marry the one you love. This was about love. And this was a huge shift in the movement. The better we got at this messaging, the more we began to win. So a few takeaways from the marriage movement from my perspective. Give yourself the time to muck around. Don't leap to strategy prematurely. Second, when the time is right, everyone needs to line up behind a common game plan. You can't be a lone ranger. And third, we really need to understand the deep way that people are thinking and feeling if we want to change hearts and minds.
That's great, and that's so important, and I really appreciated the piece you did in Stanford Social Innovation Review, and actually made me want more in the sense that I just think it's such an important story, and so really appreciate you sharing that. I want to pick up on the Lone Ranger issue. So we heard from Barbara Kellerman yesterday, and she talks in The End of Leadership, which I have in fact read, about
Last night, he read it last night.
about the focus on the individual. I kept making the jump when I read that book to institutions' focus on individual credit. The individualism is not just about human individualism, but also institutional individualism. And one of the worries I have is that as foundations have focused more and more on brand, and even sometimes I worry on performance assessment, that they look too much at the issue of what did we individually do, and yet these goals, of course, as we all know, are never going to be affected by a single institution. So Larry and Carol, you have a piece in the current Chronicle of Philanthropy about climate change. Clearly, that's a big issue. And you're trying to work together. Can you guys talk a little bit about your experiences with collaboration? And like, you've tried to do it a lot in a lot of different areas. What needs to be in place for you to be able to substantively collaborate with other funders? And how do you manage the worries maybe from your board about, yeah, but let's understand what we did, or are we getting credit for this, which can run counter to actually effectiveness?
Yep. Well, we don't have that problem with our board, and I think it does start with the board. And many of you are trustees, and of just really encouraging your staff to not be about that and to be about impact. And all of you know about Dave and Bill and the HP way, and so in the DNA of both the families and the foundations, I think it's been completely different from that. It's been about supporting other people in their leadership, being part of a facilitating style. So if anything, at our board meetings, our staff gets asked over and over again, why are we doing this and not just supporting someone else and their leadership on it? But I want to pick up on what Sylvia said, because for us, climate change, and we're constantly asking that question about what is the right way for Packard to be leading, either out front or with others on this issue. We did, as we said in the op-ed piece, the Packard family and our board as half family, half general trustees do think it's the defining issue of our time, and we've made a bigger commitment to this than anything else. I think in terms of what works and what doesn't, we started working on these issues in the 90s, and it's gone through iterations. We're now part of a big global network called ClimateWorks, check it out. But very much working in a coordinated strategy across the globe about how best to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think, one, trustees really understanding it and nurturing that these are long-term prospects. Two, having a living organization. We've been through leadership changes in ClimateWorks. We've been through strategy changes. We've been through different political contexts erupting in different parts of the world. These aren't logic models that stay static. No one ever thought it is, and you keep adapting. So those are just some of the things that come to mind for me when I think about Packard's long-term commitment and picking up on some of the themes that Sylvia said.
Great.
So I'll just add a couple things to that. I mean, I think there are two big complications with really collaborating. So one is it's a framing issue. So if I have people within, say, my organization and, say, the environment team, and they may disagree about what to do, but since they've framed themselves as part of one team, they just naturally assume they're going to figure it out and come together and agree on what to do, both of them, or all of them. And for some reason now you take people from another organization and now they frame it differently. And the point at which they'll say, well, we're just not going to do that comes much sooner and much quicker, as opposed to saying, well, we're all working on the same problem, so we just have to figure out how to do this together. And in a sense, the climate collaboration that Carol talks about is that it's what now, about 13 or 15 foundations, and they work together and they see themselves as working together. So it's not everybody sort of coming to the table saying, well, here's what we're going to do. We're happy to talk about it, but here's what we're going to do. And as long as you have that attitude, then there's no real collaboration. Related to that is then if you come to the table with your strategy all worked out, then there's very little room to make adjustments. So you have to sort of have only a partial strategy. And here's basically what we want to do, and here are the basic areas in which we want to fund. But now let's talk about how to finish this out together, because otherwise, again, it's really, really difficult to do otherwise. And then the credit issue, of course, stuff like this makes it all worse. So we're all put up, so what makes you a leader? Well, so now I have to go back and you have this sense, because it's what's celebrated as opposed to what's being actually celebrated in the community is actual accomplishments, whoever did them within a field. We had an interesting thing at our last board meeting when the environment staff was presenting to our board what we were doing on climate, and they presented our grants. And afterwards, we talked about it and realized that it was incoherent, among other things, because our grants are embedded in what's going on with this large collaborative. So the idea was, it doesn't even make sense to talk that way. You have to come and talk about what the overall thing is doing. If they want to know which grants we're doing in particular, we can tell them, but even that was a product of negotiation with the other funders. So as long as you're doing that, then we'll do this. And it's all us, and it's all everybody. And if you think about it that way, and I don't know why anybody wouldn't think about it that way, in truth, then everything becomes much easier.
I want to connect the collaboration and the policy piece and ask about a critique of foundations, and I'll aim this one at you, Larry, which is, so on the one hand, we could all say, oh, gee, if foundations could align their efforts better, right, with grantees and others, and also with each other, they'd be much more effective. And then some folks would say, the last thing we need is a bunch of foundations aligning their efforts to influence policy, right? So the critique would be it's anti-democratic, and who are they anyway to do that? You're actually trying, Larry, to I think, and correct me if I'm not portraying it accurately, but to create momentum among foundations and pursuing through your own efforts to change the way the federal government works. Because you think it's not working as it should.
I would just say to make it work.
To make it work.
I don't care which way it works, just work.
But there's been a really interesting debate about folks saying, look, foundations have got to step in. Things are not working. Someone's got to do something. And a colleague of ours who's in the audience, I had a Twitter exchange. I won't call him out, but he said, "Oh, so we're fighting plutocracy with plutocracy now."
Rob's out there somewhere.
It wasn't Rob. How do you respond to that? Why are you pursuing that effort?
Well, so in the broad sense, because the role of the Congress in making the United States work is clear; it can't without it, and the role of the United States working in the world is equally clear. So, in some sense, it's not that it's more important than something like climate change; it's that it's essential to make any real progress on any and all of the problems that we all care about. Yeah. And so, what's key about that effort, from my perspective, is our way of working on it is not driven by any particular set of, now I'll use outputs from Congress. We are completely agnostic about what the policies that come out of Congress should be. We simply want to enable it to be able to come to some resolution about what they are, because that's the way the constitutional system is structured to work. And so it's something that anyone, anywhere, whatever they are, wherever they are on any issue across the whole political spectrum, ought to be able to agree on, except, I suppose, for the really, even libertarians, I always say to them, you want government to do less. You can't even get it to do less right now, right? It's just locked where it is. So it's a sort of, wherever you are, this is one thing around which so it's a unique kind of, policy commitment. And one of the issues that we have in doing this work is most funders aren't in it for that. Most funders actually, what they call their democracy work is really to get it to produce some set of outcomes that favors some set of policies that they want. And for us, it's saying, well, okay, fortunately, it's a really pluralistic sector. There are people all over the map there, and if we disagree on sort of strategy, as long as we agree on tactics, then we can still work together, because it's going to produce the same.
So part of what we're talking about today, I think, is how you choose goals. What are the right goals to choose? Cari, I want to bring you in, and you are leading a foundation, Good Ventures, established in 2011, and there's a number of interesting things about what you're doing. I think a lot of people are kind of watching from afar, but two things that I find particularly interesting. One is that when people talk about philanthropy, they often talk about goals kind of coming from the heart, and then the strategy has to be rigorous. But you're actually employing a pretty analytical approach to goal selection. So that's one piece that's just been interesting to see in your early days of establishing the foundation. And then you also have declared, very clearly that you're going to be open in a way that the implication is maybe more open than people typically are. Can you talk a little bit about why you've made those choices and what that looks like?
Sure. Yeah, we think of ourselves, like you said, as being open in two ways. One is open to many possibilities, and that's because my husband and I came to philanthropy without a predefined set of focus areas, and we saw that as an opportunity to consider many possible focus areas and choose based on where we think we're likely to have the biggest impact in terms of improving other people's lives. And it just seems that the choice of focus area is one of the most important that a philanthropist makes, and so bringing some strategic attention to that question felt really good, and it's leading us into some directions that I'm really excited about. We also are trying to be open in terms of sharing as much as we can about what we're doing and learning. That's so that outsiders can understand our work and engage with it critically, and also so that other people, particularly new donors who are in the situation we were in a few years ago, can learn what we know very quickly and hopefully leapfrog us in the process.
You've sometimes been portrayed in the press as a disciple of the sort of effective altruism movement, and the notion that there are some, Peter Singer, I think, argues there's some goals that are more worthy of pursuit than others in terms of lives saved per dollar spent or whatever. Is that a comfortable portrayal for you?
That's not exactly how I would describe our approach. Yeah. And I think, one thing about the movement around effective altruism is that it's not everyone thinks the same way. And so I think it does a disservice to people when they use, our views, Peter Singer views, and other people's views kind of interchangeably. But I guess I would say the thing that I'm really excited about is working to improve the lives of other people as much as we can. And that, at the core, is what, to me, effective altruism is all about. And that is the reason why we're thinking strategically about where to focus. That's the reason why we're sharing as much as we can. And that's, to me, a very deep passion, actually. So it's not necessarily a choice between heart and head. But the thing that I'm passionate about is using all of the resources we have, not only financial, but also our intellectual resources, to do as much good as we can.
Yeah, that's great. I always try to argue that it's the heart that compels you to use your head.
Yeah.
Let's talk about openness. So, I mean, it's interesting to me that it would be interesting to people that you've chosen to be open, right? As if that should be so exceptional. So I just want to put this out to anyone on the panel. Why are foundations more open? Or are they actually, and we're just not paying attention to all the good stuff that's out there? Like, why does that matter? I mean, you two, again, are working together at Packard and Hewlett on an effort, the Fund for Shared Insight, that's partly about promoting openness. Like, really? We have to be promoting openness? What's going on that foundations aren't more open about what they're learning about what works and what doesn't work?
Go.
I mean, I think there's a whole lot of things, although at the end of the day, I don't think foundations are closed. It's that they've never been pushed to be open in the same way that corporations were and government was and universities were. And so it just hasn't been done, and it turns out actually to take a lot of effort to actually make it happen. So you've got a kind of lot of inertia. I mean, I'm with Cari on this. When I got to Hewlett, it was like the very first thing, and it came from looking for stuff on our own website and being unable to find our own stuff, saying, we've got to make this really easily available for everybody to see, and then the other stuff follows. And then it turns out, oh my God, you got to develop internal, so Cari's starting from scratch, they can do this. You have to develop internal processes, you have to rebuild your website, you've got to change the culture from people who are just, it's not that they've been opposed to being open, it's that they've never had to think about it much. You could say, now you got to think about it as you produce materials. You want to make sure we're going to be able to make them available. Are there privacy interests, or think about that stuff and then get it out there. So I think there's still no resistance. It's just there's also yet not enough reason. People don't really. It comes back to the collaboration point. People don't really see how important it is to make that stuff available so that you can find each other, learn from each other, so that you can take in criticism and so on. That's really what the Fund for Shared Insight is about, is the openness, is us being open to learning by other people's reactions, our beneficiaries in particular, but also other funders, grantees, and sharing back. Carol?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. We had a great breakfast yesterday morning, and there are many ways for people to get involved with this. There's a session a little later about this collaboration. But it's made, one of the things that's great about collaboration is Larry makes me think in a different way, and I learn from other people. And as I've been going through this process with Fund for Shared Insight and being part of that through Kathy Rich on our staff, it's made me think about what do we mean by being open? It has so many different words, meanings to it. So one, it certainly means agility, flexibility. I mean, the kinds of things that Sylvia was talking about, that we've been talking about with climate, you have to be willing to listen and change and adapt. But then it kind of goes through a whole thing. One is open, just being transparent. There were a lot of foundations that resisted having 990s on their website or having annual reports. And Larry and others are really leading the way about it's much more than that. It's sharing everything that you learn. Transparency, then there's sharing. Like we go out and we'll tell people what we learned. We all have these tabs on our website. What have we learned? Then there's moving up the ladder of openness. There's actually a conversation. How do we listen to each other and listen to grantees? So we'll go out and we'll do focus groups and we'll do landscapes and we'll hire people to go talk to people to learn what's happening. Pushing us up on that, on that spectrum, where actually our board is pushing us, which is great, another role for trustees. And that's going from conversation to actual co-creation. So whether it's with other funders, or it's with the grantees, or even the ultimate beneficiaries, which is a lot about, it's that word open means that whole gradation. And I think we haven't gone enough from conversation to co-creation. And it is all about having bigger impact.
And so a lot of what strikes me about this, and I want to bring it back to the kind of the new old thing a little bit, and then I want to invite the audience to jump in. But I'm having, running through my mind some of the critiques of the big foundations from folks like David Callahan on Inside Philanthropy, which is his blog or publication. And lately, he's been writing a lot about, why do you have all these staff? That the new philanthropists are doing it in a much more lean way, and they're making fewer, bigger grants, and they don't have this huge, as he would describe it, huge structure of staff and nice buildings and so on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we're saying, actually, it takes a lot of resources to, for example, figure out how to get the information out there about what you know and what you don't know. And we're hearing in our research, as we talked about yesterday from grantees, they want more support, not just financial, but non-financial, for performance assessment, help with technology, help with leadership development, even.
Yeah.
They didn't hear Barbara's talk, but
do that anymore.
so how do we think about this? I mean, so we're up here talking about all the ways in which we're going to do these things that require staff, and then grantees are saying, hey, we need more support and we want a responsive program officer, and then others I think it's true. I think David's right that there's some interesting models that are much leaner than some of the big established foundations.
I'd just like to comment from a slightly different point of view, which is that foundations kind of have one business model, and that's, it's been described as a hedge fund with a small giving program attached to it, where most of the employees work, unaccountably. Wait,
can I'd love it when people respond to that. Finish your point, and then I'd love to see if anybody would take umbrage.
And I think that we have set ourselves, so there's alternative business models. We're trying one of them. I'm sure there are others that are reasonable. But in a way, part of the reason we're so self-involved is that we're not, our assets aren't set up to say we are a part of the economy. We're not contra-economic. We have a specific role in the economy. We aren't in a kind of Ptolemaic universe where we're the Earth and the sun is revolving around us. We're in fact at least Galilean, so maybe we are part of we are one small planet in a group of others. And I think Jane gave a very elegant example, so did Sylvia, of ways that we have to fit ourselves for a voyage of being in a financial conversation as a whole with the world, as well as just in a grant conversation. Because very quickly, just instantly, we go from saying to ourselves, we can really change the world, and we're really, part of a big leadership, and we're doing all these wonderful things, down to we're talking about our grants, and we're talking about this one specific part of the foundation, when there's a completely different kind of conversation to be had. And that conversation changes the ability to collaborate. Banks collaborate all the time through syndicated financing because they do enterprise finance. We don't. We do bundles of love with money wrapped around them. Those are grants.
Clara, thank you. And I want to. Is there a 60-second rebuttal?
Well, it's not. I'm not sure this is a rebuttal, but I just think, and we have this conversation because our administrative cost ratio is higher than a lot of other foundations. We are spending more on staffing and other things than many other foundations do relative to the size of their grants budget. So our board, and they should, ask the question from time to time, why is this? My answer is, it's all about diversity in philanthropy. There's not one single approach. It's about the end results. How are we delivering impact? And if you can do that with a very lean administrative model on the things you care about, great. But if you think that there are ways, because you have limited grant dollars, that all the other kinds of activities you can engage in to use all the rest of those assets, which take staffing to do, then that's also good. But the question is excellence and impact, not model.
Great. You want to add to that, and then let's raise your hand, and our mic folks with mics will find you. and stand next to you if you're next to go. So raise your hand if you want to get in on any of the topics that we've covered.
I do.
As
and
Larry
actually, I
adds.
agree 100%. Just want to build on it a little. So, one of the things that drive me crazy about working in this sector, one is we don't actually yet have a realistic way of talking about what success is supposed to mean. So someone says there are these huge problems as though we're actually going to solve them. Okay, we're not going to. We're not going to eliminate poverty. We're not going to eliminate racism. It's foolish to frame it that way. And then so people are like, well, look, the foundations, they're not succeeding because we still have poverty and we still have racism. And so let's try something new. And here's a whole different model. And what's the evidence for it? So people rush to grab the shiny new thing, and I'm actually glad for the reason Steve had said that lots of people do, right? Because we do need the constant experimentation. Yeah. But it's so funny because nobody has any trouble saying, well, okay, you fund in A and we fund in B and you fund in C, and that's perfectly acceptable. And even within funders doing, say, climate or whatever, there's 40 different things that people do, and we don't all do all of them, and we are perfectly content with that kind of disagreement. But for some reason, when we get here, it gets framed as there's a right and a wrong way to do it, as though we actually know, which we don't. So, to some extent, I even hate saying impact because it feels jargony. It's hard to talk about this stuff at all without feeling jargony, and I would ban words like impact, output, innovation, entrepreneurship.
You're going to have a very quiet.
I know. They're just so.
The panel is going to be a lot shorter.
They're so overused, but it is all about impact, and then we expect and want a real diversity of views on what is achieving that and how best to achieve it. I mean, even if you believe that impact investing or what is a good way to go, the fact is we haven't exhausted any of them.
That's right.
Right? We haven't come close to exhausting any of them. So it's great to have a lot of people trying a lot of things. And the only thing we all are obliged to do is pay attention and be willing to change if, in fact, something looks like we can actually accomplish more. And I think everybody does that. And,
All right, let's bring the audience in, and we have a question here. And if you could just introduce yourself so that the folks behind you know who you are.
Yes, I'm Christian Ettinger with the Educational Foundation of America, and I had a question for Larry Kramer, and it was about your good government initiative that you were describing earlier, where you said that the initiatives, it was policy agnostic, and that phrase struck me because we're very much concerned with climate and climate policy, and would that be kind of a contradiction if you're trying to move climate policy and yet you have an initiative which is policy agnostic?
Yeah. So we don't see it as at all in conflict. That is to say, all of our other programs have policy outcomes. We would like to see them achieved. On the side, we would also like to see the democratic process working better. That is another, in a sense, a kind of policy. Partly, we're confident that if we get that working better, we think we'll win, but we're not doing it, and we're not trying to twist the rules in order to make it more likely that we win. So the analogy we often use is, I don't actually root for the Cubs. I'm from Chicago. I hate the Cubs. But I root for the Cubs, you root for the Red Sox. When we play each other, I want to win, you want to win, but we can both agree that there's also a set of rules for the game that are not about just twisting them so that I win more often or you win more often, particularly since the rules that make me win more often today may make you win more often tomorrow. So the democracy initiative is more like, well, what's the best rules of the game, and then we'll fight it out within those rules.
Great. Other questions from the audience?
Uh-oh.
All right. I want to talk about data and technology a little bit. What, Jacqueline, as you look out at the possibilities for harnessing technology for good, what are you most excited about?
Well, I mean, honestly, if you look at the sector, technology has transformed so many parts of our economy. If you think about banking, if you think about health, if you think about even education. But when you look day to day at some of our heroes on the front lines who are doing the most important work to take on our biggest challenges, I think it's the sector that's farthest behind in terms of not using gee whiz technology, even self-driving cars or balloons to bring internet to the world, but even just in terms of having basic cutting edge technology. So when we think about it, we think about investing in what we call moonshots, and so we do that. So we do some of the gee-whiz technology, but we also focus on, hey, let's just bring applications of today's technology to the sectors that need it. So you think about funding something like Khan Academy, which we support. It's not rocket science, right? It's just YouTube videos and some data analytics and some personalized learning and feedback and that sort of thing. But it hadn't been brought to the education sector in quite that way, and the outcomes can be pretty important. On the data point, I just want to do a shout out to Cari and Dustin and the work that they're doing. I think it's so important that we as funders really get better about using data and evidence and transparency in the choices that we're making. And I think they're setting a really strong example for high net worth individuals who are thinking about, what do I care about? Where should my money go? And how do I measure the results from that? And one of the things that she and I have been talking about is, how do we be more transparent in terms of that evidence and that data. And I can say as a funder, one of the things that we've come up against, because as Google, we can be like, yeah, fail fast, be transparent. But it's also about our partners and what works for them and what they're willing to do. So for example, when we looked into the area of clean water and, okay, what's the most effective thing we could do there? Well, we found out that actually at any given time, 1/3 of the wells aren't working. So let's help develop a water flow sensor that could transmit in real time whether or not the water is working. We had the hardest time finding partners who would be willing to come and partner with us on that. And Charity Water came and they said, yes, we'll do that. And they're essentially a UI with a bunch of on-the-ground partners. Because we were saying, we'll give you the money, the $5 million to develop the sensor, but you need to be willing to put that information real time on your web, whether every single one of your water sources, so for them that's like 16,000 water sources, whether or not it's working in real time, so governments know, your funders know, the people know, everyone at the same time. And didn't have a lot of people coming up wanting to kind of sign up for that radical transparency. So I think and I'm sensitive to...
Do you think it was the transparency that scared them away, or do you think it was...
It was us.
The ability to actually execute?
It was people like us, frankly. It's the funders that's the problem, because the nonprofits are saying, if we're radically transparent about our actual outcomes and what's happening, then the funders who don't take the time to dig in a little deeper and understand all of those dynamics are going to be scared away. So actually, I think it comes back to culpability of our sector in that we need to get better about our funding so that we can support nonprofits to really tell the truth about what they're learning, about what they're doing and what works and what doesn't.
Cari, do you want to add to that? Does your own experience square in terms of the observations Jacqueline's making?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it originally surprised us a lot that foundations weren't more transparent, and as we've tried to build a foundation from scratch that shares as much as possible, it's not that surprising anymore. I mean, it's actually really challenging. We're actively working through questions of how to share as much as we can when the information that we're sharing is the information of our partners. It's some of our own analysis, but it's also about their work, and how do we do that in a way that they're comfortable with. How do we do it in a way that doesn't put an undue burden of time on them or of our staff? And how do we make sure that the information we put out there actually reaches the kinds of people that we're hoping to reach? And so all of that is, these are questions that we're actively working through right now.
So why is it that, as we talked about in the opening yesterday, more foundations don't support nonprofits developing the ability to collect and analyze the data that they need in order to get better? Or why is it that we don't see more folks with organizational effectiveness programs along the lines of Hewlett and Packard, or leadership development initiatives along the lines of Haas Jr.? You put out, Sylvia, if I remember correctly, a pretty persuasive evaluation of that work in terms of its, and yet there aren't that many programs like it. Why not? I mean, why if we all care about effectiveness, we're all trying to get results, and the organizations that are being funded through the grant making are saying we need more different kinds of help. Why isn't it happening? Anyone?
So we, shortly after I came as president, we stopped all special reporting customized reporting for the foundation to us. We decided we're not doing anything with that information, and it's not helping our grantees. We ask grantees to actually report to a data warehouse rather than having our own kind of little data stuff inside about various kinds of things that they find helpful to them in doing their work. And that's available to us. They make it available to us to download, to then analyze ourselves. But it's a database that's comparable across industry verticals, so that instead of having this kind of self-driven, this is what's important to the foundation, we can decide that ourselves. But we can also look at our investments in the enterprises compared to their peers. And they can look compared to their peers. So it's not really about us at the center of things as much as it is about how do we move everybody up the curve? How do we find a way to improve the performance of everybody rather than our teddy bear picnic of grantees in our foundation?
Great, great. Sylvia?
So, we bake in leadership development into our theory of change. So our programs for our gay and lesbian work, for our immigrant rights work, for our education equity work, the leadership work is in service of our helping to reach those goals. So one, we think about it very instrumentally. And we think about it very contextually. I mean, the question that we ask our anchor grantees is, what's the leadership you need to deliver on the mission and the strategy and goals that you have? So it's embedded into that context, and it's very instrumental. And I want to say it costs money. So when you talk about, with the cost structures of foundations and so forth, that is a decision that our trustees made to, over and above the programmatic or general support, to line up the leadership support behind that. And it's been, I think, very, very important in helping to develop the notion of shared leadership, the importance of relationships, and something that we sometimes call generous leadership, of leading from behind and not taking the credit, because this is a collective endeavor.
Okay, quick other comments on this. Carol, Jane?
I just want to make a plea again about our roles as CEOs and our trustees. Because if you ask for it and you push for it, you'll get it from your staff. Dave was alive in the 80s. He started a management assistance program and really cared about providing grantees those kinds of resources. And we've had great staff leadership with Barbara Kibbe and Stephanie McAuliffe and Kathy Rich. The other thing is grantees, there's some exciting pressures happening. I think we've done grantee perception reports with you, and you can see that correlation between how you're perceived and to what extent you're actually having conversations and providing resources about the organizational needs. So if I want my scores to be good on one, I'm going to pay even more attention to the other. And there are some great things going on about conversations about indirect costs. So we're participating with the regionals in California and with a couple of other national initiatives to look at that. But it made me ask internally in our own foundation about how are we evaluating the needs, the indirect cost needs of organizations when we do their grants? And we have some work to do in terms of crisping that up and defining. So anyway, we all have a role to play on this, but I've even heard of some grantees saying no to grant dollars because they said, we just can't do it for what you're offering here. So,
Jane, did you want to?
I'm actually one of those grantees that didn't go back.
No.
Not of you, not of Packard, but that didn't go back for a renewal because it costs more to execute on the grant than we were receiving. Yeah. On the whole question of the relationship between foundations and data sharing, I think it comes back to what do you think your job is? What's the fundamental role? Several of us are involved in something called the Aspen Philanthropy Group. And there, we were looking at the question of evaluation. We said, well, what is evaluation for? What's the purpose? And then we can better understand how you go about it. And the consensus in the group was not only is it there to help both grantor and grantee make smart decisions, right, to inform those decisions, but it's also in order to advance field-wide learning. Now that's an expanded job description, and if that is the job of foundations, which I I actually think it is. Then transparency becomes not just a matter of compliance, but much more along the lines of Cari Tuna, in that it is all about advancing knowledge and advancing your mission. I was struck yesterday by the 41% figure, that nonprofits were only 41% were sharing the data they gather. And the results they find. That is not at all surprising to me for a variety of reasons that have already been stated, but mostly because we're just at the beginning. We're all at the beginning. And if you asked foundations, I don't think, I mean, Larry, what do you think? Would you get more than 41%? Probably not today. 5 years from now, it might be double that figure, though.
Yeah, let's see if there are any hands in the audience. And Clara or Stephen, do you want to jump in real quick as we get the mic over there?
Sure. I was just going to say we have a concept at Heron called net grants, where you impute a dollar amount to the time of your grantee. Is it $100 an hour or $200 an hour? And you multiply that by all the time it takes to apply, to have conversations with you, to come into the office. And then you multiply it out and subtract it from the grant, and that number is the net grant. And it's important for grant makers to remember that if they don't make the grant after all that conversation, that number is always negative. And that's not even counting the reporting afterward. So the transaction costs to the field for doing all the things that we load on grants is very high, just without any of the other stuff.
Let's go to the question in front.
Hi, Doug Bauer with the Clark Foundation in New York City and Cooperstown, New York. Phil, great job doing the air traffic control up there, and thank you for the obscure SNL line from season 2, I think. I'm kind of, since this has been about what's promising and what's not, I'm just curious if everyone could respond to this question, which is, if you were deity for a day, what would you change in the field right now?
And you know what? That is terrific and a great way for us to close out. So let's do that. Thank you. What would you change?
I'll start. I would Cari and I fund a group called Give Directly, and they give cash directly to the poor, and they measure the outcomes really carefully with randomized controlled trials. What that establishes a baseline. That basically says to all of us in the industry, you need to prove that you can do better with $1 than the poor could do for themselves. So I would love to establish that as a baseline for our entire industry and for all of our partners, to say, prove that you're going to do better with that money than just giving it directly would do.
Great. Excellent, Jacqueline. And perfect timing, 30 seconds each. You were right on time. Deity for a day, Stephen, what would you do?
It's a scary thought. It's a hard question to answer. I don't think there's there is no silver bullet, of course, but I do think that American philanthropy needs to focus on the fact that this country is really in some serious trouble. We seem to have kind of lost our way. We have a lot of good going on, a lot of wonderful people, enormous ingenuity, and yet we're not the country that we have always thought we are. And so I join with Larry and others who are working to try to revitalize American democracy, because that's the heart of who we are. And so I think if we could do anything together, it would be about kind of reviving that democratic spirit of America so that we can be the country we need to be in the 21st century.
Great. Larry?
I have a tear. No, I agree. I mean, so I also agree with the first point, which is there's not a silver bullet. So there's not one thing that I would do. I think that diversity is great, and I would preserve that. I would increase significantly the extent to which we actually pay attention to each other and are willing to change, as opposed to just talking about it. Although I think the thing the most, and it's funny, I had a conversation this morning where this is the issue, is, again, notwithstanding what everybody says, the truth is, at the end of the day, too few people are willing to give too little money in general operating support to the organizations we expect to do the work. So all of this other stuff is really that. You don't have to worry separately about OE and leadership if you just give the organizations the actual money they need to figure out how to do their work.
Great. Carol?
Well, I love Stephen's vision, and it made me think about think globally and act locally. It's an old phrase, But I think we're across our portfolio at Packard, we see some of the most exciting work happening locally. We also see community foundations, family foundations, et cetera, moving out globally, and yet the real sparks of creativity, innovation, getting things done around climate and around education or any subject we care about is happening at local. So I'd love to see, collective impact, successful collective impact initiatives in every city across the world.
Great.
How's that?
Great. Clara?
So I would love to see the foundation world emphasize kind of the urgency of prevention, as it were. I think, I take Stephen's point. We're in a crisis situation globally. We have sort of these wicked problems that don't have boundaries in the way that I think the foundation was originally invented to focus on. And in doing so, I think that using the tools of finance and business skillfully, rather than kind of in an amateurish way, can really make a huge difference. That enterprise finance is at the basis of a lot of the things we're talking about. I mean, I think that Larry's right about general support, but really it's not general support, it's just income or capital, and understanding the difference between those two things. So I just think that enterprise can be a very powerful tool for good, but we have to understand how to finance it well.
Great, thank you. Cari?
We've already talked a lot about foundation transparency, so more foundations sharing with as much detail and honesty as possible what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what they're learning from it. But I'd also love to see more written about the history of philanthropy, and not just the patting ourselves on the back kind, but the kind of deep analysis of the causal impact of philanthropy in big changes in the past. And that we're funding a little bit of work on that front, but I think that would help us so much, learn about what's possible and how to have an impact as a funder.
That's great. Learning from history. This is a strangely ahistorical sector, or maybe it's just we're ahistorical as a society. I don't know, so just echo that one. Jane?
Well, sort of a compliment to Clara's point about focus on prevention. It seems to me that probably the most important thing I can think of is that all three sectors begin to think long-term, and that the phrase patient capital becomes real.
Great. Sylvia?
I love coming last because I can say so much of what I loved that my colleagues shared here. I love this vision about American democracy, the sense that we are part of a global world. Thinking long term, I would hope that the trustees and the staff of foundations would find themselves a place within a larger vision and be able to figure out a way to lead generously and with others together.
Great, thank you. This, yes. I agree. So, Catherine, that's very nice. I blog a lot, so I have a lot of opportunities to get my point across. So I'll refer you to my blog. But thank you. This conversation, I think, for me was, I had high hopes in it. My hopes were exceeded. So I want to thank a terrific panel for their thoughtful engagement. Thank you.